very much, Lura, for having me and for giving me the opportunity to speak about Connect. You already mentioned some of the main elements of Connect. Um, Connect is, as you said, an Horizon 2020 funded project. It's a research project dealing with radicalization and violent extremism in the Middle East, North Africa region, and in the Balkans. It's targeting mainly young people from 12 to 30, but contrary to what is normally going on in the field of violent extremism and radicalization, we are not trying to deal with young people as susceptible, radicalized persons, but we want to get and to involve young people as stakeholders in the project. In the same way, Connect has the purpose of understanding the drivers, the factors that drive people to radicalization and violent extremism, but mainly because it wants to provide some new tools for prevention. And with these tools for prevention, it also strongly intends to involve women in this role of designing and crafting prevention tools. We want also women to get involved not as caretakers, but also as prevention makers. These tools will be addressed mainly not to security actors as normally the main stakeholders involved in the issue of violent extremism and radicalization, but they will be addressed to civil society actors and local authorities mainly, thinking about this idea that we can approach the issue and the problem much better if we work from a much more near standpoint, if we work in proximity with the surrounding, with the more affected people. When it will take place, I will follow these 5W questions of journalism. So that is the what. The when is, it is taking now. It started last year in 2020 in February, and it will go for 3 years and a half, more or less. Where it will take place, as you said, in the Middle East, North Africa, and in the Balkans. Research will take place in 8 countries, as you mentioned, but it intends to have a strong regional approach in the sense that we really think that if we have these different regions with differences not only between the regions but also between among the countries involved, we can have very interesting conclusions and lessons. Also, we think that this comparison will allow us also to draw conclusions, to draw recommendations, to draw lessons for Europe as well. Uh, Also because, for example, when dealing with the Middle East, North Africa countries, we have Muslim majority countries, but in the Balkans, we have much more diversity. We have settings where Muslim communities are a minority, and this might also extract some interesting conclusions regarding the role of religion, for example, in that sense, in the processes of radicalization and violent extremism. Who is going to participate in the project is participating. We have 14 partners from the 8 countries that where research will be implemented, but also from other European countries. And it's a very, I would say, interdisciplinary consortium, because we have either members from the academy, we have universities, but we also have think tanks, foundations, and civil society actors. So we have members of the consortium that are more research leading, but we have also other members that are more close to work with communities and with young people and mobilizing these more grassroots actors. And I think this also provides this variety and the capacity of a diverse set of competences and skills in order to approach the issue. The idea is also to study the role of different actors, not only internal actors, not only domestic actors, state actors, institutional actors, civil society actors, local authorities, but also external actors, and the role that these external actors have in designing the agenda, but also in setting the framework to understand radicalization and violent extremism. Why we think that this project is necessary, why we started to think about Connect as it is, because we realize that the issue of radicalization and violent extremism is extremely determined by the security sector. It has always been conceived and thought as a security issue. So in that sense, we know very little about how the processes of radicalization take place, because we only understand radicalization in terms that institutions and mainly security actors understand it. For example, we draw our research mainly traditionally from violent extremist incidents, from terrorist attacks, from trials that have been taking place, judging, prosecuting suspected violent extremist people. So in that sense, we drink from the same understanding that these institutions have in order to understand the processes. And this is something that is determining a very concrete and a very precise and a very stereotype, I would say, paradigm on understanding radicalization and violent extremism. Secondly, because we think that prevention needs to be re, rethought and reinterpreted, because until now, what we have is a paradigm in which countering violent extremism and preventing violent extremism is very blurred, it's very confusing. And sometimes these security actors understand prevention in the sense that it's identifying the terrorist to be or the radicalized to be, not preventing the root causes that drive people to radicalize. And this is what we want to revert, re-granting again the sense of prevention to social actors that can desecuritize the idea of prevention. Besides, for example, we have for decades, at least 2 decades, been very much focused on profiling, on the research on micro drivers of radicalization. So what turns an individual into a radical person and potentially a violent extremist. So in this idea of profiling, we have missed the whole understanding of the process. We just have limited ourselves to profiling who is going to be and who is susceptible to be radicalized. And probably we have missed the most important question, which is why certain people with the same features do not get radicalized. So this is the idea. We want to understand how radicalization processes work by studying different drivers and different levels of analysis. The drivers that we have selected are 7 drivers that will be tested. It means that the 7 drivers, which is religion, digitalization, territorial inequalities, socio-political demands, um, just I'm going to read them because I always repeat them, which is terrible, and I always repeating them. So it's religion, digitalization, economic deprivation, territorial inequalities, transnational dynamics, sociopolitical demands, and education, culture, and leisure opportunities. There are some of these drivers that are very common sense, in the sense that are commonly agreed upon. But there are other drivers that seem to be quite new in the equation of violent extremism. And this is our purpose with Connect. It's not focusing on one single driver, but trying to find out which are the combination of drivers that finally gives us a picture of which setting is more susceptible to radicalization. And this is why also we want to work in 3 different levels. On the macro level, so the level of the state dynamics, or even the transnational dynamics, the meso level, so how the collective dynamics reflect the drivers, or how the drivers impact on this collective dynamics, and how communities uh, relate with these 7 drivers. And then a micro level, which is the more commonly accepted level, which is at an individual level, how the drivers impact the individual and young people particularly. So this combination of drivers and levels will allow us to have a much more comprehensive understanding of the process of radicalization. And this will allow us to start thinking about prevention, and prevention mainly addressed to these social actors that we think that are the ones appropriate to intervene in this very early stage. So that, I mean, prevention is before any radicalization takes place, and this is what we are trying to do with Connect, and also thinking that if we more or less manage to identify or succeed in identifying which contexts with the combination of drivers are most susceptible, and why some are more susceptible, and why do not get radicalized with the same combination of drivers, then we will really be in the way of finding certain prevention measures that can be useful and addressed with the proper actors. In this, we have also the idea that we want to challenge the dominant paradigm, not only on this over-securitization of the study of radicalization and violent extremism, but also in a certain overweight granted to religion as a driver. I mean, there is always a very strong focus on religious issues and on religion, and particularly on Islam. And we think that this cross-regional approach will be very rich in that, in trying to portray diverse frameworks, the diverse frames of reference that can allow us to learn much more on the process. As a way to conclude, because I do not want to take longer, but as a way to conclude in this approach for Connect, I think that we have already drawn interesting ideas, okay, and probably Florian will expand much more with the cross-regional report that you have drafted, because it's where all the knowledge is gathered together and it's compared. But I would say that we have confirmed, that we have stated how much the concepts are blurred, how much the weight of construing, of interpreting the different terms, radicalization, violent extremism, terrorism even, is somehow very confusing, is very diverse, and this tends to impact a lot in the research. Also, we have identified a very strong need for primary data. I mean, and this is why we want to go to the field. So this is why, in researching on the 8 countries that are targeting, that Connect is targeting, we want to go to the field and get primary data from the people and from the main stakeholders, because I mean, we are always working over the works of others and relying on secondary, tertiary data, and we need to have this primary data to understand it. Also, we will take into account as a cross-cutting element in all the research an issue which is very important, which is expectations, perceptions, and even emotions in all this process, and how they impact the different drivers. The need for comparison, we think that we need to compare in order to understand much better, because at the moment, the research that has been carried out is very Western based. In that sense, it's very Europe, Central, Western Europe, or even very US based. And we need to widen up the scope of research and allowing other countries to get into the equation and understand radicalization and violent extremism. And also, we have seen how donors in funding the research have a very important role in setting the agenda for the research. So in a certain way, what is being researched, what is being done, what is being implemented is very much not responding to the needs of the local actors, to the need of the communities, but it's much more responding to the ideas, preconceived ideas of the donors. And in that sense, the donors that mainly come from the West. And I think I will leave it here because I think that it will be interesting to exchange some ideas later on and have some more room for debate. So thank you, Lura, and I pass the floor to Florian.
Thanks. I'll continue here. I won't repeat anything which Lurdes has been saying, and the report and the documents are available on the website, and you have the link in the chat box. And again, this is just this is the first phase of the project, where we're kind of more scanning the landscape rather than doing yet the original research, which Damir will talk a little bit more about, and also I think some of the ideas which Milada will raise will be very relevant. So it's more kind of an observation, because our report is combining the kind of landscape which our country reports have looked at across the Middle East, the MENA region, and the Balkans, and kind of seeing what patterns are detectable from there, and what can we take forward. And just I think a couple of points which Lurdes has made are very important for our approach. In a certain way, we are developing, or we could say also subverting, the original call which this project is based on. You can see the geographical scope was not defined by us, but it was defined by an the EU Horizon framework, which looked at these neighboring areas of the European Union, the Balkans, and the Middle East, the MENA region, as areas that is affiliated with violent extremism and radicalization. And this is, again, as Lurdes has said, these areas have been a focus of Western-funded research on foreign fighters in particular. And I think the initial call was very much informed by this wave of research funded by embassies, by other Western donors, on foreign fighters. Why do people fight for Daesh in Iraq and Syria? And this was in a certain way also localized in the MENA region and the Balkans, although, of course, in terms of per capita participation, we have also some significant numbers from the EU countries. But again, it's a very securitized approach, as Lurdes has said. It's also one which peaks very much in these fashions of research, where this gets a lot of attention during the peak of the Daesh success, and then tapers off as if there is no more problem. Because it assumes there's a problem if there's a security problem, and primarily a Western security problem, but it ignores the fact that the structural causes which motivated people to participate as foreign fighters have not changed at all. There's no structural changes. So in that sense, what we're trying to do is just trying to say we have to move away from looking at finding the problem in terms of individuals who are radicalized to the way that they become members of Daesh, but rather looking at the larger structural causes which enable it or don't enable it, as Lurdes is saying, people participating or not participating. So I think that's one very important starting point. It's kind of looking out of the kind of the waves of attention, which are often cyclical and not very structured, and don't realize that, or which ignore the fact that there are structural causes for all of this. So we're certainly not arguing that the MENA region and the Balkans are similar in many ways. They're quite different, and that's actually useful. And I think this is what we're trying to also argue, is that rather than saying this is a belt of trouble for Europe, as at least in the original call we could interpret it, we are conceptualizing it as useful in a certain way, critiques of one another or checks of differences. So, the first very important difference is that when we're talking about violent extremism in the Balkans, radical Islam is not the first challenge. It might be the first challenge in its expression in the MENA region, but in the Balkans it is not. So yes, there was some participation in Daesh in the middle of the last decade, but the most instances of violent extremism, and there's overall fairly limited violent extremism in the Balkans, comes actually often from nationalist or ethno-nationalist groups. These are groups which claim to create either nation states, exclusionary nation states, or new nation states, and there often religion has only an ornamental function, if one at all. So we also have transnational links there. So we had a number of people who identified as Serbs participating, for example, in militias in the war in eastern Ukraine. So they received a lot less attention than those who participated from, let's say, Kosovo or elsewhere in Daesh, but structurally they're quite similar. They're radicalized people who join foreign military campaigns. So this is one observation, that by bringing in the Balkans, we focus a lot on other groups rather than just religiously defined groups. And this is one where also I think we're curious to hear what Milada's thoughts are on the far right. And when we had a book discussion with which Lura has mentioned, with Darrell Lee's excellent monograph, there was an observation that the terrorism experts of the past have become now far right experts because the trains of fashion are moving on of where research grants are. So that's of course problematic, but I think it is useful to actually consider those types of radicalism together jointly, because there is, in the past, there's often been a temptation to look at the far right extremism completely separate from ethno-nationalist movements in the Balkans and completely separate from radical Islamist movements. And when it comes to recruitment, when it comes to the ideology, when it comes to the mechanisms, also the transnational dimension, which always emerges, they have a lot of similarities. And I think this is something where it's useful to bring in this comparison. Another point of interesting comparison and distinction is democracy. So while democracy is in crisis and structurally often very weak in Southeastern Europe, it is confronted in an environment where in the MENA region, most countries are not democratic. We have countries which have managed to establish democratic governance like Tunisia, but others which are considerably less democratic, and where, again, who is a violent extremist becomes a very political question. It is not about rejecting liberal democratic human rights values or not operating within a constitutional framework which allows for difference, but it's one which is very repressive often, and where people are easily labeled as violent extremists because it's suitable as a legitimacy foundation for regimes. Now, this doesn't mean that democracies don't use also the label of violent extremism to claim legitimacy. So it's a way to exclude particular opinions, or at least to securitize them. But it is certainly quite different in countries, in some MENA countries, which we're looking at in the project, where very quickly any criticism becomes labeled as extremism, and the boundaries between radical and violent positions is by the government in a certain way blurred. And of course, we cannot understand violent extremism without looking at how governments behave towards society. Is government repressive towards society, or is it in a certain way permissive of different opinions, so that there is an outlet for legitimate difference? And I think if we ignore that aspect, it again falls into the security trap of just looking at a security problem, but not at the causes which facilitate it. Another important observation from us, from the kind of aggregate study, is that the assumption that, kind of, which in the literature is often discussed, of economic deprivation, which is assumed to be a primary cause, is important, but there isn't a conclusive evidence that this is the driving force of radicalization. So certainly we're talking about societies which are overall experiencing economic hardship, inequality, and difficulty. So there's absolutely no doubt that this is something which is affecting all of the MENA countries we're looking at pretty much, as well as most of the Balkan countries, with high income inequalities, often growing income inequalities, a sense of lack of perspective. But to argue that only those particularly vulnerable in those societies are susceptible to radicalization is at least not borne out by existing evidence. Again, our further research will hopefully provide for some clearer insight into this question, but it's certainly one which remains open. A last observation before I conclude, which we also noted, is the role of religious institution when we're talking about radical religious extremism, is that on one side, in some countries, established religious institutions have a moderating effect. They are the ones which provide for, in a certain way, guidance, often steering away from radicalism. But at the same time, it's also a legitimacy question. Many of these religious institutions, and this is interesting, this is similar in the Balkans and in the MENA region, are so much under government control or are aspiring political actors of their own that they are in a certain way delegitimizing any criticism as radical extremism, because this is, of course, the currency which gets you international support. But by doing so, also undermining their own legitimacy, because the domestic legitimacy, because they're seen as being, in a certain way, either instruments of the state or of being, in a certain way, pursuing a political agenda and shutting down pluralist debate and, in a certain way, labeling any type of, so certainly the democracy dilemma of the state is replicated in a democracy dilemma of religious institutions, or pluralism dilemma, I would say, because religious institutions inherently are not, mostly are not democratic, but allowing for a certain degree of pluralism. And that shutting down of pluralism very easily then becomes a way of labeling any criticism as radical, but it also kind of pushes that debate elsewhere, and also deflects the problem that many of the religious institutions are not really accountable to believers, and thus are political actors in their own right. So this also, of course, raises the interesting question that in the conventional understanding, we often have an understanding that there's a problem of political or politicized religion, and that is automatically leading to radicalization. But I think what we're seeing here preliminarily is that, in fact, it's the politicization of religious institution which creates a reaction, which is often radicalism, rather than that it in itself is radical. So we often have moderate, politicized religious leaders who, by their politicization, facilitate radicalization as a reaction to it. So I think rather than looking at it as a continuum, we have to look at it more as a tension as well, which exists there. So to conclude, the key early observations, and this is again just the starting point for our research, is to look at the element of regime types as an important factor, to look at those different drivers, which Lurdes has pointed out in more detail, but also bringing in other forms than just focusing on religion as the main driver and the main cause of radicalization. So it might be the channel in a society which belongs to one religious community by 95%. This might be the available channel, but in other societies where multiple religions exist, or where secularism is more important, ethno-nationalism a more important factor, then other types of outlets and directions of radicalization are available and are being chosen. And if we don't compare them and don't see them how they are similar and maybe also different in some cases, we're really cutting out a large picture. And it also then, I think, in a certain way, we want to kind of put the mirror back on Europe in a certain way, although our main research is not about the European Union, although we do cover Bulgaria as an EU country, is to say that, this is not a problem of Europe's periphery, of countries on the border of the European Union. I mean, this is the area we're studying, but the mechanisms are universal, and what are the circumstances where they take place. And then religion is just the raw material which is used in the same way as ethno-nationalism might be, or white supremacist or racism. And they of course distinguish themselves in their worldview, but we have recently debates about kind of civilizationism, the idea that, also white supremacist groups often frame their goals in civilizational terms rather than just ethno-national terms. And there we see these kind of civilizational claims are in fact often very similar among those different groups. So with that, I think I've just raised more questions, but also showed how we're trying to deal with this topic critically and building on what Lurdes has been saying. So I'll leave it with this and look forward to hear from Milada about her research, and Damir as well.
Thank you, Florian and Lurdes. Now we move on with Milada and Damir talking more about future research. And thank you both for keeping to time now. Milada, floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And this report you've written, the project, is really exciting. I'm going to focus on the broader context and really pick up just where Florian left off, talking about the kind of radicalization we see in Europe on the right, the far right, and in some countries, which has become now the political mainstream in some fundamental ways, which is pretty alarming. And with these kind of broad civilizational claims, I think that really rings true what you just said, Florian, about how really they're speaking the same language. You know, the details are different, but this kind of civilizational us versus them has replaced the kind of local us versus them in some cases. So I have some slides, so let me share my slides. And Laura, please do keep me to time. So be brutal. Because so you need to let me share my slides if you can.
You just have to click on the share screen and then allow multiple people to share screen, Lura, and then it should work for Milada.
So share a screen and allow multiple, yes.
Yeah.
I see that. Milada, can you try now?
Yep, it works.
Perfect.
Okay, so just before I do that, let me put here in the chat, if you can't follow all the figures, there's some paper where you can see more of them and spend more time with them. So this is based on my recent research looking at populism across Europe. And I only have 12 minutes. I won't spend too much time on the broader picture, only to say here as an introduction that we really are just now starting to look at Eastern and Western Europe together in terms of looking at the sources of support for the rise of, quote, populist parties, looking at what kinds of populist parties affect party systems in different ways, and really, and very importantly, unpacking the different varieties of populism, which many scholars are now doing in wonderful ways. I would just say it's really important for scholars and also for journalists and analysts to really be precise when using the word populism, because it has now become synonymous with the far right, with backsliding, with ethnic scapegoating. There's all kinds of ways that populism is just thrown out there. But in reality, there are such different varieties of populism, and by being more specific, we can then pinpoint the kinds of populist parties that are leading to this kind of us versus them and the rise of radicalization on the far right. So nothing new about populism, an old tool about defending the people against the establishment elites, and the argument that elites are protecting and expanding their own privileges at the expense of ordinary people. This is an argument that I can get on board with, right? Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, they're not wrong. But how populist politicians define the people is incredibly important, right? So populism on the left tends to come from a kind of economic argument. The people are those who suffer because of austerity, neoliberal economic policies, and income inequality. And what's really important is that this view of the people tends to be inclusive of minorities, migrants, refugees, people of different races, people of different status. So I'm thinking particularly of Syriza in Greece or Podemos in Spain. The Five-Star Movement is a little more wobbly on this one, but still deserves to be in that category. One way to think about it is an exclusionary versus inclusionary view of the people. Now, this doesn't mean that populists on the right don't use these economic arguments. They do, but they really lead with a kind of definition of the people as part of an ethnicity, culture, nation, religion, race, or civilization that is under threat. There's a great article by Professor Erin Jenny from the CEU that kind of launched this debate. And I think, you know, when we look at this, we see more and more, here I'm thinking of Viktor Orban in Hungary or Salvini in Italy, PiS in Poland, Boris Johnson's version of the British Conservative Party. This civilizational argument of our civilization is somehow under threat is becoming, I think, stronger. And in some cases, like Hungary and Poland, we know that it takes this religious tact, right? That we need to defend Christian Europe from the Muslim hordes. Now, it's very illiberal and profoundly majoritarian. I won't spend too much time on that now, but it's important to see that in this definition of the people as deserving greater representation, there's also this sort of argument that if the people want it, well, this is democracy. And that becomes the basis for trumping the rights of minorities, discriminating against people of color, people of different religions. Because if the core of the people, 51% of the people want something, well, that's democracy, and we must deliver that for them. And there's also this invoking of traditional values. Now, traditional values to me, means my mother's amazing Czech cooking and the fact that I went to college with like a Czech lion embroidered on a bedspread to make sure that the Czechoslovak people would be represented at my university in the US. I mean, there's a lot of ways to think about traditional values, but unfortunately, today, the ethno-populist version of traditional values is very discriminatory, right? It is often xenophobic and visibly racist. Across these parties, we see more and more, and I'll show you some slides in a minute, that the enemy, yes, it's cosmopolitan elites, it's the European Union, it's George Soros, these culturally harmful outsiders, but the argument often centers on Muslims and Islam, and both domestic and transnational groups that are somehow allies of Muslims and Islam, right? So the argument, for example, that Orban used that in his last campaign, that somehow the EU and George Soros were going to trying to import all these Muslims into Europe in order to destroy European culture, and only Hungary could stop it. So if we think about the position, so let me show you some slides. I don't have too much time. When we look at populist parties on the left and right, so I call the ones on the right ethno-populist parties. I'll tell you a little bit more why I've chosen that in a moment. But we see that they are pretty well defined across the different party systems. This is from the Chapel Hill Expert Survey. On the bottom, you see the salience of anti-establishment rhetoric. So we would expect all populist parties to share that, right? Whether you're Syriza or you're or PiS or Orban. And here is the salience of immigration rhetoric on the other axis. So here you have Fidesz, and then the triangles are anti-EU. So they're very well defined. Here in Austria, in Italy as well, as we would predict, the FPO and the Lega and the Brothers of Italy. Now, the Five Star Movement is interesting, right? Because it is a much more inclusionary party in its conception of the people. And yet it is also very anti-establishment and anti-EU, although it has moderated over the years, and I'm not sure how really anti-EU anymore. Just a few quick reasons to use ethnopopulism. First of all, because I think it's really a strategy both to win votes and then to use representation of the true people as a way to concentrate power. Second, it's much more flexible than the old ethnic nationalism. The enemy is not neighboring nations. It's this broad cultural threat that can be so easily adapted based on who you want to be your friends and who you want to be your enemies of the moment. I love how Vladimir Putin is suddenly the friend of many of these parties and countries, allegedly. And we know from the Chapel Hill Expert Survey that many of these parties are not right-wing when it comes to economic policies. And so many of them either blur their positions or actually now are taking strongly left positions when it comes to redistribution in the welfare state, although they are welfare chauvinist positions, right? We want a strong welfare states with lots of benefits for families if they're the right families, right? If they belong to the deserving people and not to these culturally harmful outsiders, whether those are immigrants or members of the LGBTQ community or just feminist women. Let's find a way to keep them out for sure. So here you have Poland, and you can see again the way that these parties cluster. They have here you see their left wing, this is peace, left-wing economic position, and a very strong position in terms of traditional authoritarian and nationalist. Austria, very similar positions for the FPÖ, but not so left-wing when it comes to the economy. So this is more typical of West European ethno-populist parties, that they're blurring or they're kind of moving around. Our experts aren't sure. There's a high standard deviation because they're not sure where to put them on the economic left-right. Now for our discussion today, this chart, which I'm sorry is so small, is really useful because, and I will share it in the chat after I'm done, if I can figure out a way to do that. But what you see on the bottom, so this is 8 different cases across Eastern and Western Europe. And the bottom axis is the salience of anti-establishment rhetoric. And the vertical axis is the salience of anti-Muslim rhetoric. And again, this is from the Chapel Expert Survey. And you can see to what extent many of these parties score very high on anti-Muslim rhetoric. And it's really actually dramatically surprising, as we know, in countries like the Czech Republic or Poland, where you have virtually, well, you had a very positive experience in the 90s with Bosnian refugees. I would say that, you know, Islam was not politicized. And you see in the last 5 to 10 years, just this intense politicization of anti-Islam, of Islamophobia so quickly. And I'll just end with some thoughts about, you know, how that's possible. You know, it's not just about kind of changes in the structure of political competition. So, you know, we have cases in Western Europe where we have these new populist parties that come in, and they do kind of blow up the party system, but they don't really change the substance of the debate. So we've shown, for example, that in places like Italy, the five-star movement, you know, you can see a huge transformation of the party system, but the substance, whoa, oh, sorry, my slides do this to me sometimes. The substance doesn't change so much as a result of the five-star movement. It's really these extreme ethno-populist parties. In France, here you can see the UDF. And I'll just end here because I'm running low on time. You know, the greatest change in the substance of party competition has been where these powerful ethno-populist parties are in power, where they're incumbents and they're able to use being in office to push through these majoritarian appeals. And I think that's surprising sometimes because we think of the greatest impact as being new parties. But in terms of this kind of radicalization of taking what used to be on the extreme political right and making it into the mainstream, that has really happened where these mainstream conservative parties been kind of remodeled using ethno-populism. So Hungary is the best example, as well as the British Conservative Party. The US Republican Party obviously is another example. And this has really led to greater polarization. And here I think it connects really nicely to your project, because with this polarization, we see normal voters who would tell us that they strongly believe in democracy, but they have become so convinced by the us versus them narrative, where opposition parties are lumped together with culturally harmful outsiders, with Muslim immigrants, that they essentially will give up on democracy. It's too high a price to pay if the opposition will come into power. And so they have a kind of intense hyper-partisanship that trumps the value they place in democracy. So there are a few ways in which I think, we see that across Europe, that when left populists have been in power, now there's not a lot of cases, right? That it's been relatively the case of moderation, of them being tempered by being in power, but not so with ethno-populists. In fact, being in government seems to have more or less radicalized them in all of the cases. And I would argue same with the British Conservative Party. But I will end with just some positive slides, which is that the center holds when it comes Europe so far. This is from 2019, of course, but the rise in voting for far-right and ethno-populist parties has been matched with a surge in voting for the center progressive and pro-EU parties. And I'll just end with my favorite protester, who tells us that it's so bad that even the Czechs have started to pray, and brings up an interesting point about the role of religion. Just as Florian said, very present in the case of Poland, where there's this kind of Faustian bargain between extremists and the Catholic Church and the ruling party. And in neighboring Czech Republic, where you have as intense, or even more intense Islamophobia, there's virtually no role of religion. And so it's a really interesting case. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Milada. And now Damir.
Thank you very much, Lura. I'll be talking a little bit about the research that we have been doing so far in the project. And I mean, this connects very well to both what Florian and Milada have been talking about. The project in its sort of, the call for which the project was submitted was supposed to be very sort of one-sided in a way. So it included MENA and Balkan countries, which have some Muslim minorities. There was sort of a clear sense that there was a need to see this factor. And I mean, I fully understand this. The call was written right after we had a lot of foreign fighters moving to Syria, and there was a need to try to assess especially the role of religion in motivating young people to leave the countries of these regions to go and fight religious wars. But since then, you could see in most countries that this focus on elements of radicalization, on the drivers of radicalization, has shifted and broadened at the same time. So Lurdes mentioned them, and I'll go through them sort of to give you an idea of what we have found out so far. With the research, it has mostly so far concentrated on institutional factors. This is sort of the first aspect of our research, where we speak to representatives of different state institutions, security institutions, religious institutions, societal, so civil society institutions, media, and so on and so forth, to get their sense of what these drivers actually mean and which are relevant for their work. And religion is not the most relevant one, surprise, surprise, at least not in all contexts. So the first driver that we sort of tried to look at, territorial inequalities, which historically was seen as one of the main drivers, is something that's not seen as that explicitly relevant any longer. This usually is, if it is relevant, connected to another driver where you have different identity issues, different belonging that can then accentuate territorial inequalities. So regions that are less developed are usually not the ones that get radicalized, for example. And you do not even see sort of radicalization on long urban rural divisions. For example, in Bosnia, a few years ago, you had a very strong radicalization of small, sort of secluded communities, and this is no longer the case. The radicalization happens in suburbia right now. The second driver that we had was economic deprivation, and there's this whole sort of economic deprivation theory on which this is built, that individuals radicalize because they see economic grievances as a factor that drives them towards seeking to alleviate that in some way. And again, this has not been proven to be explicitly a cause, at least not on a sort of more broader level. We'll see how it factors into sort of individual research with with individuals when we look at a very sort of macro level of that. But economic deprivation on a more broader scale, in terms of thinking about communities or municipalities, this is not, again, something that has been shown to be explicitly relevant, at least not on that level. There is an idea that economic deprivation will probably become relevant later when we talk about individuals. But again, there are contrary examples that some of the more radicalized individuals, those who have also left to fight with ISIS, actually came from affluent backgrounds. So it's not something that's universally applicable. We have a driver that we thought was going to be relevant, and that's definitely the case, which is political types of grievances or political ideologies, or what we basically term them as political ideas. Ideologies carries a lot of baggage with it, grievances even more. So to think of it as political ideas, and again, this is this ethno-nationalist aspect, it has proven to be very relevant in almost all Balkan cases. In the MENA region, it's there, a little bit less relevant than in the Balkans, but it's still present. In almost all Balkan countries, you have sort of political ideas and nationalism as a driving factor of radicalization. And again, this then moves the whole debate out and away from Islamic radicalization into something that's much more sort of right-wing politics. And I'll sort of give you a few ideas of groups that we also decided to sort of try to look into that really show that this is a relevant factor. Cultural factors, what we usually described as ways of life, as ways of connecting with a community or a subcultures. This is something that's there, but it's not in itself something that provokes or drives radicalization. And it's very context dependent. So again, from the reports that we have gotten from our partners, some of them single it out as a contributing factor, while in other cases, it's almost not mentioned at all. This is also something that sort of grouped several aspects together, this sort of way of life or way of belonging to some subcultures and communities. It's not probably that well defined, at least not on this level of talking with institutions on how they deal with it. We have the elephant in the room, religion, as a driver. And there's a whole gamut of sort of relevance that we have found there. In some cases, it still is very much relevant. So in Kosovo, it is singled out as probably the most relevant factor, even yet still. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's not as relevant or not considered as relevant. It's still there as a very important factor, but not as the main driving one. In the MENA region, religion definitely plays an important role as a driver. But then again, we don't have religion as an overall factor, but we think here about interpretations of religion that justify violence or that legitimize violence for certain actions. Now, these radical interpretations of religion, this is then again when you sort of move into from a more broader perspective of religion and Islam down towards more secluded and closed communities. And this is something that we will definitely be looking at in the next phase of the research, trying to single out these sort of communities that have a more violent interpretation of religion and that can then contribute and use religion as a driver of radicalization. We have digital literacy or digitalization and social media as another driver. And this has sort of proven to be relevant, but more of a tool than of a driver in itself. It's always used in conjunction with one of the previous two. And it's something definitely that some of the sort of next step cases will look at or will include. But then again, just looking at digital literacy in itself as a driver will probably not allow us to capture this sort of narrative of radicalization, not the whole process. It's just looking at the tool in itself and the ability to interact critically with this tool. And finally, we had sort of transnational dynamics. And again, Balkans are very, very well represented there. So transnational aspects, both related to migration crisis, related to nationalism, related to the wars of the 90s, they're all there. Foreign influence as well. We have seen that in several countries, sort of foreign influence from the Arab Peninsula, sort of more radical ideas, and also schooling. So imams being schooled in countries of the Gulf, then coming back with a more radical interpretations of religion. Transnational factors do play a role here, but they're very diverse and they're very context dependent. They relate a lot to other factors, be it political ideas in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, be it religion in other contexts. Now, what does this all mean? All of these factors sort of build on each other. We had a difficult time first to identify all of these 7, to operationalize them, but it's even more difficult to separate them individually when trying to look into cases. So they're often sort of overlapping in several aspects. One of the examples that we might look into in Bosnia and Herzegovina, I think Bulgaria is also thinking about this, is sort of football associations or hooligans, to put it that way, which blend ideas of nationalism on the one hand, sometimes sort of anti-Islamic ideas, with ideas of some kind of subculture, some kind of a cultural understanding of a group. And trying to figure out which of these drivers is actually the one that most contributes to their radicalization. That's something that we will probably deal with in the next phase. And also when we talk about online communities, so online Salafi communities, sort of preachers who put videos out of their sermons and then sort of energize their follower base. It's both sort of a blend of religious radicalization and digital aspects of it being used as a tool on the other hand, because the digital aspect in itself sort of builds the community, builds sort of a sense of understanding that then can, in one's own perspective, legitimize the radicalization of that person, sort of being part of that community. And there are obvious ones. So nationalist organizations, the Chetnik organizations, for example, they sort of fall pretty squarely into sort of a political ideology space. There are even sort of, in the case of Bosnia, sort of totally tangential ones. So schooling that is divided along ethnic lines, for example, which then can contribute to ideas of us versus them being much more prominent, and something that in itself can contribute to a more radical understanding of the other, of how you interact and how you express yourself towards others. In other countries, I'm not fully aware of where they are in the process of selecting which communities they'll look at. So there might be even more diversity when it comes to especially the MENA region, and also what you can access. This is sort of the next step that we are thinking about. We also need to work with these communities. We need to sort of interview the people who we consider radicalized and extremist, which proposes in itself sort of challenges that nobody really wants to be considered as being a radicalized extremist. And this is something where you sort of really need to be careful in selecting these communities. Sometimes it's even the most radicalized ones who are open to this because they want to show how normal they are and how they're not actually those who you think of them. But yeah, it's sort of a 12-minute mark. It's sort of an aspect of research where we are sort of touching ourselves, well, not moving forward in a very dark room, sort of finding our way bit by bit, because it's not something where you have a clear research agenda from the start. And I think Lurdes might have mentioned this already. The methodology of the whole project is set up as such that while moving step by step, we build the methodology for the next part is the research. So right now we're building the methodology for the research where we look at these specific communities that get radicalized. In the next part, so towards the end of the year, we will be moving more towards individuals and looking at the factors that motivate an individual to become radicalized. But yeah, it's still an open project, and we're probably going to be working on this for the next 2.5 more years. So there will be more results coming.
Thank you, Damir. Thank you, everyone. This was, in a way, I think we opened more questions than we offered answers. But that's really the point of this whole thing, to really think of new approaches and kind of new challenges that face us. And I think that always starts with questioning, right? So talking about questions, is anyone in the audience already burning to ask a question? If so, please either raise your hand or turn on your camera and your mics and ask away. Any burning questions? You can also write them on the chat function. Or if people are a bit shy, I could also ask my questions. And then maybe we break the ice a little bit. Okay, I'll ask my questions, and then if we have someone else wanting to ask, please just raise your hands. First, Florian already mentioned this thing that we had last 2 weeks ago with Daryl Lee, and one of the speakers saying kind of how you have researchers moving from radicalization to far right. But I agree with what Florian said, in the sense that, you know, there is a need to kind of create some sort of framework where we investigate or look at these two factors, because they do have shared characteristics. So perhaps here, I don't know if Milada and Lurdes would want to share something in terms of your views, in the sense of what do you think the added benefit, or is there an added benefit of treating these two within the same framework? And what are kind of, in terms of thinking future-wise, I know this is a tough spot to put you in, but just, you know, what would also be the risks to avoid? What would be the do's and the don'ts of joining these two fields and really looking into this project from these two different perspectives? And Damir, in the end, you mentioned kind of these different forms, including hooliganism, or so-called hooliganism, or, you know, fan cultures and subcultures. And here the question arises, you know, how broad can we expand the study? And this also relates to what Florian was presenting. How broad can we go? How broadly can we speak of radicalization? Do we put all the groups into one? Or do we, you know, in the end, we have to cut the red line, right? The red tape. Then the question is, how do we decide where the red tape ends? So since you've already been doing field work, I was wondering kind of about that aspect of, you know, where do we draw the line? And for Florian, I also had a question, although we wrote the report together, but I think just a reflection also on the transnational aspects, because we also have with this project, what's interesting is that we have kind of two regions that, although they're related maybe in action, in research we've rarely seen this kind of transnational, transborder research that connects these two regions. So, and I know that in the report there's some findings about that. So I just wanted to encourage some more thoughts on that topic. Thank you. Just to see if in the meantime there's any questions. Otherwise we can start with the answers, and then the participants might be inspired to ask more. Shall we start with the order? Lurdes first?
Okay. Well, I was thinking. Well, I think it was really interesting, and I really enjoyed Milada's presentation because it's the newer part for me. I'm much more used to work on Middle East, North Africa issues. So, for me, always the topic is much more centered on religion. So, in that sense, I think it is interesting because it allows us to get distance from the mainstream narratives that that dominate in a sort of way the interpretation of radicalization and violent extremism, and allow us to see different patterns of of collective dynamics, which I think that this is one of the key issues in the project, trying to find out which collective dynamics tend to intersect in order to create these susceptible environments for radicalization. It's like when you mix the two regions, the Middle East, North Africa, and the Balkans. I mean, even though it makes comparison very difficult and it forces you to have some sort of very delicate balance, and Florian has already experimented that, and yourself you have experimented that, because you have to always navigate between the differences, and there are very clear, very stern differences between one region and the other. And particularly, I would say that there is a certain more homogeneity in terms of countries within the Middle East, North Africa region than within the Balkans. So in that sense, it is a challenge, but it also will allow us at the end to have this much wider angle of approach to the issue in terms of not focusing on the narrow elements, but focusing on the wider perspective, and that will allow us to learn on the process itself, not even though it is not exclusively based on Islam or far-right ideas, etc. If I may, now that I have the floor, I think that I mean, just thinking about what Florian and what Damir said, I think that in the political elements we still have something. I don't know to what extent it's not only. I would like to know to what extent it's not only the political ideas as drivers of radicalization, but the impact or the perception, for example, of political systems, the impact of political systems can be understood as drivers of radicalism. For example, for me, in the Middle East and North Africa, the resilience of authoritarianism, for example, and how in a certain way there is a very clear nexus between repression and radicalization for certain political religious movements. I don't know if you have found out in the first drafts of the papers that we are receiving on the macro research any idea on that. On the issue of territories, it's very interesting what you say, because, for example, at least from my experience from the Arab Spring, what we saw is that the territorial unbalance was a sort of driver for revolt during the so-called Arab Spring popular revolt. So in that sense, it's interesting to see how territorial inequalities might drive demonstrations or protest movements, but may not drive radicalization, which is something that we could maybe at the end infer, and it's interesting. And with these issues, we had a conference at IEMed some weeks ago by a French researcher, and for example, he was challenging the dominant paradigm, saying it is big cities where with poor neighborhoods where radicalization takes place. And he said that he had been on the subjects in France that he had been studying, he had observed that radicalization took mostly place in medium small cities than in big cities. It was less an urban phenomenon as we saw faced in these suburbs of cities, and it was more a phenomenon of fractures, which is also, I think, something interesting to take into account. And I will leave it here, otherwise I could be talking too much.
Thank you, Lurdes. Florian, will you take up your question?
Sure. Very briefly, I mean, I think the interesting thing is exactly that, like, I mean, it's the challenge of this project, but, you know, traditional research is, you know, you look at far right in Western Europe, you look at ethno-nationalism in the Balkans, and you look at radical Islam in the Middle East. I mean, that's kind of the mental map. And I think we have to challenge that and saying, I mean, even if this might be the main manifestation of something, we have to look at it comparatively, and rather than assuming that these are kind of separate silos you can't talk to each other about. And I think this is the first thing we're trying to do. Even if the project does not bring in Western Europe explicitly, it does so indirectly, and there's a lot of existing research we can draw on. And that a lot of the assumptions don't work. And I mean, I think one thing which Lurdes said, and I was also thinking about, I want just to add to that, is that, you know, people have different, you know, people are alienated or challenged by the environment they live in, and there are many responses to it. And one response can be protesting for democracy, and the other one can be supporting a radical movement. And, you know, and the same we see that, you know, I think a lot of people who are, especially from the profile we're looking at, you know, young people, you know, most people in the Balkans go to Western Europe if they are alienated from the political system. They pick up their bags and they move to Austria and to Germany to get a job. I mean, this is the response. So I think we have to also realize that in the universe of potential people who are, you know, who are alienated or who feel frustrated with the political environment and socioeconomic environment, there are many choices which people have, and some of those choices are personally very, you know, benign and successful, like emigrating, or might be societally very beneficial, like protesting for democracy or becoming active in a social movement against environmental degradation. And so I think we have to also mentally understand radicalization not just as a kind of deviant thing, but as one response to a whole set of challenges where people can react in multiple different ways. And there are other ways in which people can react and which might be productive in many ways. So I think that's important. And to briefly respond to Lura's question about the transnational dimension, of course, this is something which is very important, and Damir mentioned it also looking at it in the analysis, is that there are these different ones. I mean, there's on one side the transnational links with the MENA region between the Balkans. I mean, in terms of education of religious personnel, and also sometimes radical ideas communicate back and forth. And we had this in our book discussion. I mean, it's kind of most notorious radicalism, but even that should be kind of at least looked at through its complexity. But then, of course, a lot of it works with diaspora communities in Western Europe. Again, I mean, that's where Western Europe comes in. And we can't study the MENA region, the Balkans, without the elephant in the room, which is the part of Europe where a lot of citizens of both regions emigrate to, where there are large diaspora communities. And those ties are very important. And they're both, I think they're often, again, looked at mostly through the lens of radicalism, saying they're radical imams and they send YouTube videos and people are radicalized through social media networks and so on. That's certainly one side of the story. But I think, as I was mentioning, immigration is also a de-radicalizing strategy, because people, you know, choose to live a different life somewhere else. And it might also have a de-radicalizing effect in terms of ideas which are shared. So I think, again, we also have to not pathologize diasporas. I think this is a risk which we see sometimes, that diasporas are seen as these crazy radical people, not just knitting nice flags, as Milada was suggesting, but also doing more dangerous things, but actually seeing that they are much more complex actors, which also can actually counteract radicalism in different ways. And so I think this is where the transnational, I think, can be brought in a constructive way.
I'll just jump in with a couple of points leading off of that. First, I would agree that, you know, this definition of traditional values and the way that has been kind of weaponized is really interesting, and I think is very generalizable, right? How are quote unquote traditional values, that nostalgia for the past, how are they weaponized? And oftentimes this is interwoven with the nostalgia for a more patriarchal society, and there's a lot of gender elements to that, right? So both the kind of radicalization in fundamentalist Islam and on the far right in Europe has a very anti-feminist element to it, right? And this kind of put the women back in the kitchen, have as many children as possible, etc. So there's one, and this hijacking, I think, of traditional values and redefinition is something that is common. The second thing I think is common in terms of a generalizable framework is looking at the top down. In Western Europe, especially, we're obsessed with the bottom-up sources of the changes in people's attitudes over the last 20 years. And there's a reason for that, because political scientists have volumes of public opinion data. And so to be able to say that people change their minds because of changes in globalization and job security and immigration, you can really run a lot of wonderful statistical analysis. And I'm not saying it's not wrong, that it's wrong, but the element of the top down is much more difficult to study, but I think incredibly important. So what are the political uses of reifying these civilizational divisions and mobilizing people around them, intertwining them with these traditional values that are supposed to be sort of the soul of the people or the nation? And where does religion fit in? To what extent do these political leaders then have, for strategic reasons, alliances with the most extreme representation of that religion in that political space? So we certainly see that in Poland. The Catholic Church in Poland still is a very diverse institution with the institution not so much, but the people who identify as Catholic in Poland certainly are. But today I learned recently from a former solidarity activist, that something like 80% of young men who are training to be priests right now in Poland vote either for peace or for Konfederacja, which is an extreme right-wing party. And that's like 20 to 25% voting for Konfederacja. So that gives you sort of a sense. Now, he argued that this bargain would be kind of a Faustian bargain, in the sense that they would lose moral authority with young people. So that's an interesting question, I think, for you to look at, whether these political uses of religion, while perhaps recruiting some people to more extreme positions, may also alienate and kind of lose another section of the population.
Thank you so much. And Damir?
Okay. Where do we stop? I mean, it's difficult to sort of set an end point where we should limit our research, to put it that way. On the one hand, because the research subjects that we are involved with, they're also evolving. So this connection, for example, such as in Poland, between hooligan groups and politics, it's something that is evolving, and it can very easily spill over to similar aspects in the Balkans, and is happening. I mean, it happened in Serbia in the 1990s. This close connection between radical groups involved in sports and politics as such. So, I mean, I think that the main sort of reason, or the main sort of goal, and where we should try to push this forward, is to try and find, well, first to identify this individual mix of radicalization drivers that are relevant for each country or region, because there we will find a heap of differences. Something that might be explicitly relevant in Kosovo might be totally different in Bulgaria than in Bosnia, and not even speaking of the MENA region. Because one thing that we have seen so far is that there is no single driver that is explicitly relevant, but that there's sort of a mix of drivers that play into each other, that sort of build on each other to create a situation of create instances of radicalization. In a next step, this would probably be to sort of, when looking at the individual level, in the end, to try and find, through a comparative approach, some common aspects. So what radicalizes individuals, at least my guess so far, will most likely be similar, while sort of what happens at a more broader level of country-related structural issues, those might be then again very different. And another thing is, I mean, so far we have mostly looked at ways of drivers of radicalization, and this next step will also be to look at ways to de-radicalize these populations. I mean, we are mostly dealing with young men, to put it that way, and this is also something that then builds on a more inclusive societal approach of how do you deal with young men who might have radical ideas. Previously, you send them to the army for 5 years so that they get sort of indoctrinated. Now you don't do that anymore, but you have to include them in other ways that also make them feel worthwhile while not sort of letting them slip through. And I'm thinking about these ideas of first, what are sort of common individual aspects, and then also how to address that within extremely different contexts. I mean, it was very telling to see how different even Macedonia and Kosovo are in sort of the drivers and what drives young people towards radicalization. So I'm looking forward to the next step of going one level or two levels down and looking at these individual aspects of radicalization, of what is similar in all of these countries. And I think that there we might find something more of a solution of how to address this.
Thank you, Damir. Thank you all. I do have, I don't know if maybe Lurdes, if you could answer one question, I'll read it out so that we save time. But Eric has this question on, he says, glad to see so many important aspects of the problematic being mentioned. Do you collectively have any conceptual model that ties together the existential, sociological, and political aspects that are interdependent, and how those levels influence each other? I understand this is not a question to be answered in 1 minute or a minute and a half, but take your best shot. You're muted.
Sorry, I just missed half of the question, which makes things even more complicated. But the thing is, if I didn't to approach the research in a sort of interdisciplinary way, no?
Yeah, so
I mean,
different aspects and how they interconnect.
As Damir said, we didn't build a very strong or very fixed methodology at the beginning, because one stage informs the other. This is a sort of Lego building blocks construction. So in that sense, if we try to fix things from the beginning, we did miss the opportunity of learning things in the process. And this is what we are doing now. We are, for example, constructing the methodology for narrowing down the research to the community level, which is the meso level. Okay, and in that sense, now we have to manage to combine different variables. Okay, one variable, which is one axis of variables, which are the drivers, and another axis of variables, which are the contexts. And we have also to try to get some capacity to compare between case studies and between countries. So in that sense, this is a real challenge, and we do approach the issue from different perspectives. The fact that we have researchers that come from sociology, the others come from political science, there are anthropologists. So in that sense, there are psychologists as well. So in that sense, we try to mix a little bit the approaches and not to single out one only approach, because otherwise it's very much, if it's, for example, I'm very much used to deal with the topic from the political science or from sociology. But there are separate, in certain terms, the research has been like separate compartments. And this has brought a very separate understanding from each field. So psychologists work on individual micro drivers of radicalization alone, but do not work so much. So social psychology in that sense, and to understand the collective dynamics, will also be interesting. But there is no theoretical common joint framework for all. And we are building for stage of the research.
You actually managed to answer it. So thank you very much. I would like to thank every one of our speakers for attending tonight. I really enjoyed the session and has definitely given me food for thought. And I hope that is also the case with our participants. I would like to remind everyone that if you're interested in this project, please go to the website of the Connect project, where you can find the cross-regional publication, but also regional publications and local publications that have more focused data on a country or region you're interested in. So yeah, please go and check that. And also to anyone celebrating tomorrow, happy Eid. I'm gonna go and see my family at last, so I'm very happy. So yes, I wish you all a very good evening, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.